Yeah, I guess we'll start with the big question, Damien, as I'm sure everybody wants to know. Why on earth are you a Hull City fan?
I was traumatised from a very early age, probably like most football fans, by my dad, who had moved to Hull in the 1960s, and me and my two older brothers, because he was a big football fan, were dragged to watch Hull City. And we actually saw them through quite a good era to start with. This was like the 1960s, middle to late 60s I started going, 1967, 68. So I'd be about 5 or 6. And it was a good era. They'd been promoted from the old third division to the second division, which is now the championship. And they had a really good side, really strong side who challenged for promotion for probably 4 or 5 seasons before they tailed off, and then became pretty mediocre after that for quite a spell.
So was it growing up with Hull City? Did that sort of fuel your passion for football?
Yeah, I suppose in tandem with playing at school as well. My heroes growing up weren't the obvious ones, the sort of the George Bests, and I was a big fan of Pele. I suppose everybody was, but growing up, it wasn't the big stars of the day. It was the Hull City players that I looked up to, the people like Ken Wagstaff and Chris Chilton, who older listeners may remember. All men in the 70s now. I've got to know a little bit as they've got older as well, but they were my heroes. So it was playing football and it was watching Hull City in tandem, really, that sort of fired my interest in football.
And with Hull City, to be honest, Damien, obviously over the past sort of 10 years, there's been some really big highs and some really big lows. Obviously from when you were a youngster, can you sort of give us an indication and sort of an understanding of the best moments you've seen as a Hull City fan and just figments that stand out?
Well, from the start of my career, the best moment was probably we got to the quarterfinals of the FA Cup and played Stoke City at home. This was 1971. And Ken Wagstaff, I've already mentioned, got a couple of goals. So we were 2-0 up. We were in what is now the Championship, Division 2. And Stoke were a pretty good team in the First Division, now the Premier League. And we were 2-0 up at home. And Ken Wagstaff, for one of his goals, actually sat Gordon Banks on his backside and just slotted the ball past him. And we thought we're on the way to the semi-finals of the FA Cup. Unheard of as a Hull City fan. They came back and won 3-2. So that was an early, I suppose, glimpse into the how football can kick you in the teeth, I suppose. And then more recently, 2008, promotion to the Premier League, unforgettable afternoon. Local boy done good, Dean Windass with a volley to beat Bristol City and get to the Premier League. Never ever imagined in my lifetime. Never ever imagined I'd see them in the Premier League. But that was just a glorious afternoon. Grown men in tears, including me. And I think at the time we didn't really care whether we survived in the Premier League or not. It was just getting there. That was the big prize. And that is still my golden memory of being a Hull City fan.
How have you, when you've obviously started following the sport, Damien, or sports, how have you seen, I guess, football in particular change over the years?
It's unrecognisable. From when I first went and stood on the terraces, and there were terraces back then, it was dangerous, it was violent, it was aggressive. To now, some people say it's too sanitised, but I think, although I sort of look back on the old days with fond memories, as unpleasant as they were at times, the modern game is unrecognisable for it in terms of the quality of the pitches, the quality of the stadiums, the fitness and skills of the athletes, and just the whole match day experience. I still sometimes marvel when I go to the loo at half time and wash my hands in hot water, having used the loo. Because in the old days, it was you went to the toilet up against a wall in a shed. There was no hot and cold water. There might have been cold water. There was certainly no soap. It was just really, really primitive. And that's just a small sort of snapshot that I always quote as to how the game has changed beyond all recognition in the time I've been following it.
And what is it like growing up as a young individual on the terraces watching Hull City. What was that experience like? You talk about it being sort of violent and quite aggressive. So can you give us a picture of what it was like at Hull for a young lad like yourself?
And at the time, you never really questioned. You just kind of accepted that this is the nature of football. It is brutal and primitive in many ways. So it was hard. Yeah, I mean, it was. Certain clubs had a reputation when they came to Boothby Park to play. It's the obvious clubs, the sort of Millwalls and the Leeds United, who had a reputation, rightly or wrongly, for having a hooligan element. And at the time in the 70s, when I was probably just coming into teenage years, the worst were Manchester United, believe it or not. So a visit from Manchester United when they got relegated to Division 2 in the mid-70s, A, was a big game. B, they were going to bring thousands of fans because they had a huge following. Some of them were a hooligan element. And C, it might be dangerous. So it's the only time I can remember as a kid, my dad insisting that we didn't stand on the terraces. We went in the stand and sat down because that was a safer area for a young lad to be. And I can't recall whether there was any trouble when we played Manchester United at Boothby Park in the 70s. There may well have been. My memory can play tricks, but I won't even go there. But my biggest memory is that we won the game 2-0, and Ken Wagstaff got on the score sheet again. And again, dreamland. We're beating Manchester United, who not long before had won the European Cup and had all these star names, and yeah, little old Hull had done it.
Boothby Park or the KC?
Boothby Park has so many memories, and it's easy to look back with rose-tinted specs. But at the end, it was a bit of a dump. I mean, I think even most ardent fans would accept it. It'd been neglected for years. It was falling apart. A lot of people say it was rather soulless ground anyway. And I kind of get that. If I look back at my favourite grounds, putting aside my obvious kind of affinity to Hull, I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite grounds to watch football in. But it holds all those memories of going to the match with my brothers and with my dad. And you can't really take those away. And so I will always look back with rose-tinted spectacles, and I will just forget all the stuff about the fact that the toilets were terrible, it was dangerous, and the ground was falling apart. It was our home at the time. KCOM Stadium is a fine example of a modern stadium. When it's full, it's bouncing. There's a great atmosphere there. The pitch is fantastic, and it's starting to create its own memories. I know there's some unhappy times with the owners now, but in terms of what we've achieved in the time we've been there, it's made memories for us already, even though we've only been in the ground for less than 20 years. So, yeah, with my rose-tinted spectacles on, I'd say Boothby Park, but with my realistic head on, I'd say it's got to be the KCOM.